Welcome to Brian Says. This segment is for Milo Warnock. He's not here to say these words, so I'm saying words for him. It may not be for me to say them, but I am anyway. When I first began working at IDOC, one of my roles was to speak for those who had no voice, advocate for those who were unheard, and say what they could not. I've done this in various roles over the years in different areas. At IDOC, I found that when I did this, I had an almost immediate pushback from my leadership from the very beginning of my employment. Feel free to revisit the Kevin Sagayo segment if you're wondering what I'm talking about. IDOC is such a hostile and toxic workplace for anyone who speaks out that it is now dangerous. Of course, it was dangerous before, but over time it's going to only continue to get worse. And it's not just for the public, but it's dangerous for the offenders, dangerous for the staff. And not just the staff who inflict harm upon those innocents, but staff who does not do those things. It also falls on the staff who's actually trying to help people. And why is this happening? Well, this is all at the feet of IDOC. So, yes, I am not unironically describing those in prison as innocent. They are innocent. They made choices which placed them there, that is for sure. But what is inflicted upon them through denial of medical care and denial of basic human rights and being treated inhumanely, the offenders in this case are the innocents. I've already mentioned how this is actively making Idaho and our society more unsafe. This leadership group is turning people into monsters, and they're the ones that are responsible, not the offenders. The offenders, if you are unaware, have no rights. They are beholden to IDOC for essentially everything when they are incarcerated. This is a huge responsibility that IDOC continues to abdicate on. When IDOC works, as they did, to remove voices who speak out about these violations, those harms, and those offenses against these innocents, it endangers everyone. My case in point today is specific to this man, Milo Warnock. Before I begin, I'd like to address the title of this channel. The IDOC is a criminal enterprise. A criminal enterprise is many things. It is something that operates outside the law. It is something that is not accountable to others and makes its own rules. And most importantly, it has no transparency. IDOC is a criminal enterprise. Why? Because it meets this criteria. If you do a little search on Google for what a criminal enterprise is, how IDOC operates is not just similar, but exactly like one. I encourage you to do that. Go take a minute and go look. IDOC makes changes and changes its policies and does so with little to no oversight. There are benefits to this in some cases, but an absolute ability to do this has generated an unsafe environment, which is reflected in both current and past events. Once I suggested a position within IDOC where somebody went around and talked to people and tried to help them within the system addressing things that were happening, well, I guess you can probably guess how that went over. So a criminal enterprise commits felonies just as IDOC does. It is well known. The story regarding the illegal purchase of drugs across state lines with cash, Idaho taxpayer cash, by the way, by the current IDOC director. So if you're unaware of what occurred with that, I put a little blurb on Instagram so you can take a look at that article. What is less well known is this current leadership has kept multiple books to shield themselves from transparency laws, rules they continue to evade. Why would they continue to evade them? Because they've gotten away with it. This is also a criminal enterprise endeavor as well. You keep multiple books so you can show people what you want when you want. So, like for anybody who's in the Senate or in the representatives here at the Capitol, they're showing you what looks good to you, not what's actually happening. You have no clear idea what is going on, and the public can't request that either. Next, IDOC is a hostile workplace for both the offenders and staff, well known as the recent officer who fled the country after exploiting his caseload. That happens all the time. I'll also have a link so you can check that out on Instagram as well. Also, feel free to revisit the Woodland conspiracy post. It's clear what I was doing. What is not clear is why my leadership would then fabricate a story about what I was doing, chose to never speak to me about what I was doing, placed it in documentation then to terminate me, and then refused to release information for more than 8 months, so I had no idea what they were actually referring to. Do you believe that is an outlier? Actually, that's the norm. Less known, less well known are the rapes that occur within the prison where someone is not just abused but suffers continued abuse uh, through staff and fellow co-workers, but also the rape charges from a few years back where somebody was raped. They tried to go back to work and basically were humiliated at work by fellow staff members. Um, Also, there's a link on that too. So less well known are the multiple instances of staff having sex with the offenders. This happens often, and leadership goes to great lengths to protect their friends, going so far as to go after the reporting staff, which often results in their termination, not the ones who are actually breaking the law. Has IDOC published around these topics? No. In fact, IDOC leadership has directed staff who are writing IRs around these topics to submit those IRs without IR numbers. Why would they do this? Well, it makes it easy to destroy those IRs and misplace them because there's no IR numbers. So I will cover that topic in another segment, but for this one, we'll continue forward for context. And finally, prior to discussing Milo Warnock, I need to mention very briefly the director of IDOC, Josh Tewalt. It's notable that the same charges that placed Mr. Warnock in prison are extremely similar to those that Mr. Tewalt faced. The only difference was one person didn't go to prison and the other ended up as a director of IDOC. If anyone other than Mr. Tewalt had taken the same or similar actions, they would be in prison. Buying narcotics across state lines with cash, with no purchase order, and then transporting those drugs, that would be a felony. But not for him. That was a promotion for him. It is not without irony to note that the same crimes that landed Mr. Warnock in prison allowed for Mr. Tewalt to be director. And yeah, that bears repeating. These are all points preliminary to discussing Mr. Warnock in order to create some context. Context is important because IDOC doesn't want you to understand what is actually happening. What happened to Mr. Warnock did not just happen. It happened because the environment at IDOC is one which is purposely deceitful and incompetent. It is not something that this leadership is unaware of. They know all about it. It is something that they intentionally nurture and grow. How do they do this? Well, they actively eliminate any voice or action which seeks to address harms, dangers, and violations of basic human rights. In the name of using a term called team player. And you can go to my Instagram site and see expectations where they expect everybody to be a team player. And if you're not a team player, if you raise a valid concern or an issue, now you are somebody that must be removed because you're not a team player anymore. It's a very simple and innocuous term that IDOC exploits ad nauseum. So Milo Warnock, he died December 10th of 2023. This was not released to the public until the 12th of December from all indications. And ask yourself, why wasn't this? The 12th is a date to note for myself since I was talking to FBI Special Agent O'Neill regarding IDOC. Topics that we discussed went over just why IDOC was complicit in the deaths of offenders, deaths of the innocents in the public, and deaths of those who are on supervision in the public. Multiple things. In addition to those topics, I discussed how their negligence was not by accident, but by design. Deliberate incompetence is negligence and it is criminal. And in the case of Milo Warnock, that negligence resulted in his death and again is also criminal. IDOC deliberately placed Mr. Warnock in harm's way and did so in such a callous manner that it's pretty shocking. One may have some doubts about how that could be, so we'll kind of discuss that a little bit. So maybe by shining a little bit of light into this darkness, we can perhaps allow there to be some accountability for IDOC. But the darkness is intentionally created by the department. So, if you didn't know this before, every move within prison with regards to the offenders is made with intent. It doesn't happen by accident. There are specifically assigned move coordinators whose only job it is to decide and determine how movement occurs. Now, Mr. Warnock did not just accidentally become housed with somebody who was extremely violent and dangerous. As I said, it was done with intent and purpose. Regarding Mr. Warnock, he was in prison for multiple DUIs. He struggled with his mental health, and he was literally brand new in prison. Long-term offenders have a term for those who are brand new in prison, but it's not really appropriate to say in this format. So Mr. Warnock is not and was not a criminal in prison. It is in prison that a person can be who they wish to be from there to here, back into society. He was someone who had a disease that ultimately kills over a period of time. But once introduced to IDOC, his death was not only accelerated, but made certain through their neglect and incompetence. Idaho taxpayers entrust that IDOC meets mission parameters, one of which is to contribute to the safety of the public, or it used to be. Due to the extreme level of incompetence within IDOC, they've actually make Idaho a much more dangerous place. And since I'm speaking to this specifically regarding the leadership group of IDOC, it's them that this all falls on. There's a page where they're all listed, every single one of those people. Additionally, it should be known that this blight created by this leadership team does not start and end with them. It is throughout the agency, and it has been occurring for over decades, and has only grown and become more insidious. So here is the mission statement recently published by IDOC. We envision a safer Idaho with fewer people in its correctional system. Our mission is to create a model correctional system that provides equitable access to programming and opportunities that reflect a community experience, foster connection, and restore victims of crime. We value integrity in all our interactions, respect for diversity and humanity in each other and those under our jurisdiction, positive attitude that recognizes everyone's ability to change. Cannot emphasize enough just how hollow those words are. So instead, what IDOC does is make it less safe for the offenders, the public, and those released from prison. This is reflected by the recent deaths in the public, by the recent deaths in the prison, and something not tracked by IDOC, at least that we can ever see, overdoses, suicides, and everything else. Once they're out, they become a totally different issue. So let's talk about Milo Warnock. Who is he? So from news reports, he was described as a kind and thoughtful person who wanted the best for his family and others. He was described also as being remorseful for his actions and that he was overall a kind person who had mental issues. And he had been diagnosed with a bipolar disorder as well. Mr. Warnock was originally convicted back in 2021. So he was no longer driving, he had a job, he was paying his bills, and he was doing his best to move forward. IDOC knew all those things about Mr. Warnock, and instead of placing him where he could immediately go to work, they placed him in a spot where he would not be able to work. Once in prison, he was taking medication for his bipolar, Effexor, I believe is what it was called. And even IDOC couldn't help him do that one thing, which we'll cover talking about medical, but medical is a known issue with Corizon and Centurion, who took over for Corizon, which is essentially the same staff, they just renamed it. But anyway, they could not even be bothered to meet his needs. So even after he tried to correct the issue, instead of it getting better for him, it got a lot worse. And I recommend that you go out there and read this article if you haven't already. Um, it's in the Statesman. It's about an Idaho prisoner who was beaten to death. Um, Family is seeking answers. So take a look at that. So Mr. Warnock came into prison and almost immediately was given what is called a Class A DOR. For those of you who are not familiar with this, let's define what DORs are. A DOR is an acronym for a disciplinary order report. There are multiple levels of discipline within prison. The lowest level is like what most of us know as a verbal. Hey man, don't do that. You're going to get in trouble if you do that. So you just get a verbal. Uh, if it continues on, then you get a Class C, which does not impact your release dates or any educational opportunities or your movement or your housing. However, if you get enough Class Cs, that can trigger a Class B, which actually will. So Class Bs do affect opportunities and release dates, but just like Class Cs, if you get enough of them, they can then elevate to a Class A. So Class As are the highest level of discipline with IDOC. Class A impacts your release dates, your housing assignments, educational opportunities, recreational times. A Class A DOR is bad. Bottom line, you get a Class A DOR, that messes with any possibility you are hoping to have a reasonable release date. Mr. Warnock had a 2-year fixed, so he could still overcome the Class A in theory, but starting off with a Class A is not ideal for sure. So he was given that Class A. And let's just be frank about this. This is due to IDOC's incompetence and neglect to the mission. This was not Mr. Warnock's fault. Mr. Warnock was upfront and honest about what he was doing and what his problem was. IDOC staff will tell the offenders, hey, if you make a mistake, tell us, we'll work with you, we'll help you out. This is what Mr. Warnock did. Mr. Warnock had been in prison for basically less than a couple weeks, and I'm not sure exactly how long he was there, but it was a short period of time, and he was trying to navigate the whole system, and it's a lot. So the one thing that one has to keep in mind regarding Mr. Warnock, he was in prison for alcohol and not drugs. This is a distinction with a difference because alcohol is a drug and is illegal. It is illegal, and it is a legal substance that Mr. Warnock struggled with. And when you pair that with his mental issues, that makes it even more of a challenge. Another thing to keep in mind is that Mr. Warnock was in prison for a nonviolent crime. He wasn't there for violence. He was in prison having been assessed as well as someone who struggled mentally and been provided medication to assist him with his struggles. So that's an important part or piece to this. Let me repeat it. He had been prescribed medication to assist him with his mental health, and this was a known issue for him, his mental health. Mr. Warnock, in the short period that he was in prison, had zero warnings or issues and was simply trying to navigate how to get through things. Mr. Warnock chose not to complain about his new path and to learn. He was an advocate for himself and others, and of course, this is also represented by the stories that people have told about Mr. Warnock, both prior to and after he got in prison. One constant of prison is the investigators and the officers within the prison will tell the offenders that if they are truthful, they will be fine, that they understand mistakes and will try to help them so they can leave, because that is the goal, of course. You are in prison for your crime. Your goal is to get out after you've done your time. But the truth is that each officer and investigator is trying to make it to the next promotion. And one of the things that happens within this environment, set up the way it is that they do so at the expense of the expensible, which are, of course, the offenders. So the offenders pay for this. Mr. Warnock believed IDOC when they sold him this story. He did not know or understand what was coming. He had no idea. This belief and trust in IDOC is what killed him. At every turn, Mr. Warnock did the right thing. He accepted the punishment for a crime and the consequences which placed him into prison. Mr. Warnock entered prison and kept on. He was prescribed a medication, and while he did indeed cheek his pills, he did so in order to adjust when he took them so he'd be able to sleep. It is easy to say that this was criminal thinking on his part, but what it really is, it represents just how broken things are within IDOC. Because of this, offenders within IDOC make these decisions fairly regularly, daily, for they have no way of helping themselves. And if they complain, they are now the issue, whether they are or not. So a future segment will explore this more in detail about medical and why it is not what it appears from the standpoint of what IDOC says it is. I will review denial of medical treatment, harassment, and threats by medical, and more. And I have a lot of IRs on that too. Here it cannot be stressed enough. Mr. Warnock broke the rules. He knew it. He was aware of what the expectations were. Because of this, Mr. Warnock had no excuse and continued with his path of acceptance for his choices and their consequences. Mr. Warnock's pattern of behavior here is consistent and clear, both prior to being in prison and during prison. However, this is just one piece of his path. Part of the IDOC mission is to rehabilitate, to teach, to model appropriate behaviors and actions, and help people learn new skills. It is often said that in prison, that is where one is not to be punished. That is their punishment. That's not the case, is it? Once the sergeant regarding Mr. Warnock confirmed the story that he was saying was true, there was a very clear choice. One choice is to the mission, and one is not. The choice that the sergeant made is not to mission. IDOC not only chose to punish somebody who made a mistake, but did so at the highest level possible and resulted directly in Mr. Warnock's death. So this is in two parts. Mr. Warnock's story was not just ignored and he was not helped, but it got even worse for him. The sergeant, in this case, confirmed that the pills were just as he said, and he also was able to confirm it literally with a 2-second phone call to medical that those were prescribed pills to Mr. Warnock. This is the first part. The second part, Mr. Warnock was rolled immediately. If you're unaware what this means, it means that he was found to have prescribed medication that he was then moved and put into segregation for drugs. For drugs that the staff confirmed that were given to him and prescribed. Mr. Warnock did not have an excess of his medication. He had on hand exactly what he was supposed to take. This was a completely unnecessary move and one done with zero compassion for the care of Mr. Warnock. It was done by all measures, one taken against someone who can be and should be classified as compromised. He was somebody who was ill, someone who is known to make poor decisions. You do not punish someone who is a compromised individual in such a state. Not only did IDOC do this, they did so to the degree that it cost Mr. Warnock his life. Now keep in mind, it would have been one thing if Mr. Warnock had gotten into a fight, was a threat to the security of the facility, or really any issue at all. Mr. Warnock was not any of those things. He is treated as someone who was an immediate threat to the safety not only of those around him, but to staff and to the facility. All these things, which are patently false. That is what a Class A DOR represents. IDOC officers and staff have the ability to use discretion, but because of the hostile and toxic work environment created and maintained by IDOC leadership, there is fear to do any of these things, unless, of course, it comes from the very top. If you are uncertain of this statement, let me refer you again back to the Woodland conspiracy, where a staff member was attempting to report drugs to the in the community and what happened there. Or I'll refer you to my initial 6-month evaluation and to the Kevin Segayo segment. That was a time when a brand new employee noticed and observed IDOC kill an innocent man. They are innocent in prison, men and women. And because this is where they are the most vulnerable, They're now at extreme risk when IDOC operates in this manner. You can believe the staff would speak out or make decisions if they could, and they are paralyzed by both fear and intimidation by leadership. I personally endured this for essentially the whole time that I was employed, choosing to not be intimidated by leadership even when they were actively engaging in it. Leadership makes it a point to make examples of staff who do speak out, and I was warned more than a few times by fellow staff, of course. So it's not just here that IDOC failed Mr. Warnock. IDOC failed Mr. Warnock on each successive step, almost from the moment that he came into the system. The final piece here is that Mr. Warnock was placed in a cell with an offender who was known to be violent. This is not and was not by accident. IDOC did this on purpose. No movement happens, and I'll stress this again, no movement happens within IDOC without vetting the housing where an offender moves. Not only did IDOC know that the offender was violent and dangerous, they did not care. Additionally, IDOC did not take any steps to ensure further safety of Mr. Warnock, who was brand new, literally, to prison, something that IDOC is required to do to maintain safety within the prison. This level of negligence here, at this point, is breathtaking. So, let's keep in mind that offender deaths in custody generally do not happen. However, death within the IDO system is not. It does happen quite often. We just had it happen recently. How many people have died due to violence, due to drugs, due to injuries sustained in prison inflicted by IDOC staff? How many people on supervision die as a direct result of actions by IDOC? As an Idaho taxpayer, we have no idea. IDOC has gone to great lengths to hide all of this information around these topics, and they continue to. The transparency that I speak of is missing. Take Bobby Templin. He is an offender who had his wrist broken during a use of force by an IDOC staff member, who to this day, Bobby Templin has not had his wrist fixed. It remains broken. You'll find a segment on this, and also, of course, there's an article in the paper as well. So IDOC obscures and hides all this information. So since 2021, there's been 3 published deaths by IDOC, and they're the following. We have Gerald Cummings, Junior Garcia, and of course Milo Warnock. Let's talk first about Gerald Cummings. He died in December of 2021, and his murder was arraigned in less than 30 days. So what happened there? Well, this also falls directly on IDOC. The offender who killed Mr. Cummings had been moved from another facility for attacking somebody. IDOC goes to great lengths to not report violence, and in this case, by not doing so, they caused this death. So the gentleman had 24 hours earlier attacked somebody without provocation or warning, and instead of putting him in seg and doing an investigation, they immediately moved him, and less than 24 hours later, Gerald Cummings was dead. Junior Garcia, he died in June of 2023. The arraignment there was in October. So that's like 4 months. So Mr. Garcia was attacked by 2 offenders. This has occurred in an area where security is both visible and present. So did staff just like stand by? Now, this occurred at IMSI, which is also known as Max. No offender at Max moves without any sort of presence by staff. That place is locked down. So what happened there? Was staff lazy, complicit, negligent, all of the above? Good question. And now we're talking about Mr. Warnock. So of those 3, Mr. Warnock now is approaching more than 5 months without any resolution. So what is IDOC hiding this time? The family of Mr. Warnock deserves to have closure. It is inexcusable that within a secure environment that where there are cameras recording all movement, that this investigation is not complete. Additionally, officers do regular checks, or do they? So far, there's been no release of any relevant information. One constant refrain from IDOC over the years has been that they do not release camera footage for security reasons. Not only is this a farce to maintain this at this point, but it's also very disingenuous as well. Any offender incarcerated for any period of time can easily map out all the cameras with ease, anytime. So it's like saying in public that the officers who are wearing the officer camera, they can't be released because it could be sensitive. That's a lie. It all can be released. Release that video now. So what does it show? What are they hiding? We have to ask that question. Were the officers negligent with their checks and multiple offenders attacked Mr. Warnock? Were the officers forging their logs saying they were checking on Mr. Warnock and doing tier checks when he was attacked when the video shows that they didn't? Did others attack Mr. Warnock besides, other offenders? Was staff involved? We don't know. The director, Josh Tewalt, instead of, stepping forward and assuring the family that justice for Mr. Warnock will occur and that the investigation is ongoing and will be completed, is instead hiding in the shadows. Once again, the family of Mr. Warnock deserves far better than this. Mr. Warnock, you are not forgotten. Your wish to help others is going to continue. Your passing will bring change. Rest in peace, Mr. Warnock.